All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for those of you who have been introducing yourselves in the chat. We'd love to see that. We'd love to see that engagement. We see a lot of familiar faces here and a lot of new ones. So welcome, welcome. If you've never been with us before, we are Ministar. We're a nonprofit that works to connect, build, and nurture the tech ecosystem here in Minnesota. I'm Maria Plessel. I'm the executive director, and I'm really excited to have you here today with us for this awesome topic. A couple housekeeping things before we get started, and I pass it over to Key and our incredible speakers. You'll notice that we have two features, the chat, which you all have been doing a great job of introducing yourselves with, and we also have the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the page if you're on desktop. You can funnel any of the questions that you have for our panelists and for our talk today in either of those two sections. We will be kind of going through, we have a couple questions that came in ahead of time, but we will also be trying to get to as many of your questions as possible. The topic today is everyone's favorite topic, money and compensation. So we have a lot to talk about, and we're really excited with that. One thing that I do want to give a shout out as a resource before I pass it over. This was a resource that was referenced in part 1 and part 2 of our State of Tech Hiring in Minnesota series. And that is the developer salary survey that Matt and the folks at Invisible Network put together. I believe, and Matt, I believe, is here, so he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they did one in 2020 and 2021. So I'm dropping the link in here for the one for 2021 because I think it's a really good resource for us to be centered in this conversation. You'll be able to see trends that are directly from data from job seekers in mostly Minnesota, mostly tech-focused jobs around the salary changes over time and what the expected salary range is. We all know that salaries are up right now, and recommendations for teams, so recommendations for hiring teams. So that is a resource that I just wanted to throw out there. And Matt, please chime in the chat with any questions, and any questions that you have for Matt on that survey, please reference that. And if we have time, maybe we'll pop into that as well. So that's enough about me. I am going to pass it over to this incredible lineup. Key, why don't you take it away?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this next edition of the State of Tech Hiring in Minnesota. Today, we're going to be talking about salaries, compensations, and benefits. And with our panelists today, they come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and we'll be able to answer all of your amazing questions related to this topic. We have some questions that we're going to ask, but don't forget to pop questions in the chat or in the Ask a Question feature down below. So to get started, we're just going to introduce our speakers and give them a chance to give a little bit of background about who they are, where they're from, and what they represent. And so we'll start off with Marissa Brandt. Take the mic.
Hi, so my name is Marissa. I'm currently VP of Engineering at a company here in Minneapolis called Valtira. We're a software consulting company. I've previously been VP of Engineering at a company in Eagan called White House Custom Color. And I also worked at the University of Minnesota for a number of years as a senior manager. So I have done some speaking about negotiation and strategies for having a productive conversation around benefits and compensation, but also I've been on the other side of the table as a hiring manager.
Awesome. And our next speaker today is going to be Trina Olson.
Greetings, everybody. It is so great to be with you. My name is Trina Olson. I use she and her pronouns. I am currently the co-founder and CEO at Team Dynamics. We are a national strategy firm based here in Minnesota, working on race and gender equity, helping folks really live into their values across a variety of sectors. We love all of our tech clients. And prior to being a co-founder, I have hired hundreds And it's got to be at least 1,000 people at this point, because I used to work on issue-based campaigns. So having to go into cities and states, working on issues we really cared about, we had to build a big team quickly. And recently, my co-founder, Alfonso Winker, and I have released a book called Hiring Revolution, a guide to disrupt racism and sexism in hiring. So we love talking about salaries and benefits, especially at the intersection of equity.
And our third speaker today is Ken Thompson from Calabrio. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. Ken Thompson. I'm a director of research and development at Calabrio, where we build software to help companies manage their customer interactions, often via call center. Prior to Calabrio, I spent some time in pre-sales at Amazon and really just cut my teeth as a software engineer, largely in the entrepreneurial kind of startup space as well.
And my name is Keith Clark. I also work at Calabrio too. I introduced myself in the previous sessions, but if you weren't there, I'm a software engineer. I work in analytics. I previously worked at the Federal Reserve and Best Buy, primarily focusing in front end and back end development, and now cloud development as well. So enough about me. To jump into our first question, today's conversation is about compensation, benefits, and salary, but we know that what's represented in this group is more than just software engineers. So as a whole, let's talk about that. I want to target this first question to Marissa. Just based on your experience, what are you seeing as current trends in terms of salary and compensation? What can people expect? What's the typical fare?
So I think one of the things that's really been shifting with the pandemic is adjustments to location-based compensation. So there are a lot more remote options that exist now than existed 2 years ago. I think that's a trend that was already underway prior to the pandemic, to be honest. Most of the places that I have worked, we've done at least some remote hiring, and that trend obviously dramatically accelerated. But for bigger companies, there's been a lot of adjustments to salary based on location, and there are kind of different bands based on how high the cost of living is perceived to be. That, I think, is one of the things that's really shifting right now, and that was not so much the case prior to the pandemic. So I think people here in Minnesota are in a good position because this is not a high cost of living area, and salaries were being adjusted downwards if you were working for a company on the West Coast. And that is increasingly not the case. And that is one area that you can try and negotiate for, is to have that equity across whatever geographic region you're in.
Yeah. Ken and Trina, would you like to follow up with that? Did you have any thoughts or anything that came to mind when you heard that?
I think I just double, kind of two thumbs up on that. That's certainly what I've observed in terms of not just my own hiring, but in colleagues, and in my own changes. Amidst the pandemic, I'm a statistic in terms of the Great Resignation and having shifted roles in companies during that time, and I absolutely observed that just in my own conversation, as well as what I've seen in my peers.
And I would just layer on, modern day workplace research, and obviously so much is happening right now. We know this moment in time is being researched even while we're living through it, is there really has been this paradigm shift, right, of thinking about workers as all willing to sort of bend over backwards for any job. And a lot of the things that have just sort of been lurking below the surface, especially like need for compensation that takes into account caregiving, whether that's of elders or young people, is also something that we're thinking about. So it's sort of in that interplay between salary and benefits as we are thinking about what is covered, what isn't, who's considered family, who isn't, and what actually our folks are forced to pay for in their lives. So I think a really good conversation that's surfacing is, we know what we pay people. We don't always understand what their cost of living is because of student loan repayment, because of predatory lending, because of lack of access to homeownership or loans. So I also just think this bigger conversation about where workplaces fit into a complex economy.
Wow. If you don't mind, Trina, just to follow with that, do you think that compensation or pay has changed because of the pandemic? And if so, in what way? Like, how do companies think about um, the cost of living or personal responsibilities as being contributors to how much they're willing to pay?
Yeah, so because of writing the book, Alfonso and I were forced, or I'm going to say, got the pleasure of doing a very deep dive into modern research. And essentially, the pace of pay equity, especially across race and gender, is glacial. So there are places in sectors where we think we are seeing really immediate change. And some of that can be because we went from a norm that was really about salary secrecy, which is how pay inequities can continue to sort of lurk around, and then pay transparency. But folks culturally are still really having a hard time not trying to get a deal when they are hiring somebody, right? And the reality is, if you are recruiting for and attempting to retain top talent, folks aren't just going to shift over from a job they already have to yours at the same level. So how are you actually going to be competitive and pay people what they're worth in your company? So I think it's a really hot topic right now as we're shifting to a new landscape where folks are going to really start to see above board, out loud, in front of God and everybody, what folks are getting paid and how that makes us feel taken care of or worthy or valuable.
Mm. Ken, you kind of mentioned this idea. I can't remember how you worded it, but it was like a great exodus or something like that. Tell us a little bit more about that, and if you can as well, how does that relate to like how people are negotiating salaries and stuff? Are people negotiating up and down, or if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what you said?
Yeah, I referenced the what's called, I think, a number of things, but the Great Resignation.
Resignation.
I think a number of different takes, and I'm not an expert on that particular topic, but I'll speak to my experience. And so, really, amidst the pandemic, I'll just say different experiences. Really, I'll just speak to my experience. Impact on mental health, right? And values in terms of what you value from work, what you value from home, and how that balance shifted. I have 3 kids at home, and I was pleasured to, you know, able to spend more time with them than I was used to, like during working hours, right? And so that amongst a number of things, and I think just more awareness about how I spend my time, the spaces that I spend my time in, that just created a lot of, like I said, awareness, a lot of uncertainty. And like I said, just some revisiting and time to revisit what I valued in each of those areas. And so I think as Marissa, or maybe I think it was Trina, you spoke to other benefits. It's not just about salary. And so in my case, I looked far deeper into what I wanted in a job and what I was doing with my time and how that balanced out with the way I was spending my time throughout the day more holistically. And so I expect that in some way, shape, or form, everyone was going through that. And so that was a larger piece of the shuffle. I think it had less to do with pure pay. Now you combine that with the reality that now more companies are hiring remotely and doing less adjustment to geographical regions. And now you have them already have, people having a wider eyes to more opportunities, and that being, potentially accelerated or, maybe there's a different word there, but another factor there is potentially more excitement as it comes to, potential salary or a different pay band that you haven't had exposure to. I think all of that kind of pays into why you saw increased shuffling around. I know that played a part for me.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that piece of the Great Resignation, which also I am not an expert in. Just anecdotally, I think that people are really spending a lot of time thinking about their priorities, and the combination of having more choice because so many more companies are hiring remotely. So it's not just limited by what's here in Minnesota, but also thinking about yeah, spending more time with your kids, having more flexibility as far as how you do your work, whether you work best with more one-on-one interactions or whether you need more focus time, what that really looks like. I also think that people are spending more time thinking about the way that their values align or don't align with their employer. And so again, just like in the group of people that I know, there's been some shifting around based on that, and having more opportunities definitely is part of that picture.
Hmm. On the topic of remote working now, if anyone's been paying attention to conversations on Twitter and LinkedIn, there are people have a lot of different thoughts about working from home. One of those is that now the home is an office, and where some people might have had that as an optional thing, for some people it's now a requirement. To you, Trina, do you see that companies are doing something to create benefits around the idea of working from home, since they're saving money by not having to procure office space and resources? Are companies trying to incentivize people to work from home while offering benefits?
So I think companies are trying really hard to creatively meet the needs of who their current staff are. I think they're struggling to imagine future staff, but there is often a big enough mix to be able to really navigate, okay, so yes, I'm going to save money on office space, but I have a couple staff members that I didn't know didn't have, enough broadband at home for their 3 kids, right? To your point, to be on internet school as well as them. So they're buying like boosters, they're buying, remote workstations, things like that. And I think the reality is when we think about work that has some pretty clear outputs, our job as managers and leaders is to make sure we are resourcing our staff to do their work the best they can, right? And the reality is there has always been a mix of preferences of working in person and remote. But we all just sort of conflated proximity physically with better collaborative work, which just isn't true. We might be near each other and not working super well together, and we might be really far away. So I think folks are trying to figure out how to budget short, medium, and long term for things like more actual like tech in the home. Like you're going to have to pay for some hardware and some software. Imagining how many of folks really have an undisturbed, uninterruptible space where they currently live, or if folks are going to start doing things like stipends for folks who are moving so that they can actually get additional space in the place that they live. If folks are going to give stipends for some folks to go to co-working spaces rather than just like host a singular space. So I think folks are trying to imagine a hybrid future. And I do think this is where some of the companies that have been distributed for more than a decade are out ahead, and we have a lot of lessons we could learn from them.
Very insightful. And co-working spaces sound so nice right now. So pivoting a little bit, I want to just chime in a couple of questions from the audience here. So we have a question from Paul, and it says here, do you think that these salary increases are long-term sustainable? And is there a plateau where the increases start to fall off? And anyone can feel free to chime in for that.
I think it depends on companies' relationship to their own profitability standards and their sort of cost benefit analysis about retention, right? And so part of it too is, for example, at Team Dynamics, we're a pretty top-heavy organization, meaning I had to go out and pay big enough salaries to recruit other DEI directors. Right? I've got like a lot of director level folks. And so it's that idea of how easily replaceable is the actual role you're looking for? What is the cost of training somebody into that role? And what are you assuming is going to be the tenure of a position? So how honest are you being that folks are going to grow out of positions? Or are you really interested in creating a path for growth internally because you're big enough to do that? So I think there are going to be sort of some caps and a little bit of like coming back down to normal. But I also think knowledge work is only getting more competitive. So the idea of how do we plan for costs and budget that are probably most skewed towards getting the right people, and that's going to cost real money.
Ken, so you were kind of mentioning that people are moving for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, salary is one of them. I guess my question is, if people are getting significant salary increases by moving from one company to another, given the circumstances, um, what would you tell someone who wants to stay where they are? How can someone who wants to stay where they are, get that competitive salary or catch up and not fall behind?
Uh, Transparency is where I lean towards. As someone who has had those conversations about someone potentially wanting to leave because they felt that there was a pay gap, and having conversations with people who wanted to come because they were having a pay jump. In both scenarios, I've advised really just honest conversations, because making decisions around salary alone is short-lived. We all, experience some level of normalization across any changes in our lives. And that's one that I've seen. I think we've all experienced that quite a bit during the pandemic, where you saw other values become more important, and you see salary, decrease. And so, for someone who's at a company that wants to stay there, but aren't happy with their pay or don't feel like they're capable, like, talk to your leaders about that. And share that. And I would say be prepared to come with market data. There is data that's out there. We've shared one at the top of this conversation. Use that as part of your conversation. Just be prepared to say, this is what I think is what I'm worth. This is what I feel I could go, what I could get elsewhere. And I'd like to, I don't want to leave. I've had success with those conversations. I've been on both sides of that. And that's what I'd recommend.
Yeah. And I would second that recommendation to talk to your manager. I think there's almost no company that isn't already at a management level having a conversation about needing to increase comp across the board, because, honestly, inflation is high. Just the actual cost of living is going up, even if the job market, the landscape wasn't changing, and it is changing. So when you bring that up with your manager, they really should be expecting that.
And that brings us to a great segue to talk about negotiation. But first, I want to just chime in one more question from the audience about transparency. This question comes from Will. Are you seeing companies embrace or push back on pay transparency or published information about that? And if they are, what are the management's concerns? And I'll target this question to Trina first.
I had a feeling it was coming this way. So thanks for the question. You're going to be unsurprised. The answer is both and. So there are companies that are really embracing and getting ready to deal with the fallout of what it takes to just really shift from knowing that we're across tenure, knowing that we're across experience or expertise, and actually being in rooms together, understanding the pay differentials. So where that really goes sideways and when folks are resistant is if we're not actually acknowledging the different expectations we have at different pay bands. So for example, if I'm paying you more than $100,000 a year, do I have an unset expectation that you're going to answer the phone almost any time I call? Maybe, maybe not, right? But as we talk about, right, what expectations do we have at different pay bands, that's a big deal. In some industries, there is huge resistance, in part because we have 4 generations simultaneously in the workforce, right? Y'all will be unsurprised to find out that all 4 feel deeply misunderstood and disrespected by the other 3. I don't love that for us. I don't love that we're all having that problem. But the reality is, right, the goal line has moved a lot, especially for folks who have been in the workplace for a long time. So expectations about who should be earning what sort of the track to an increase is, and then what should be a secret versus what should be confidential is sort of just a big conversation. And this is not about turning any generation into a caricature. There are very real reasons everybody was trained the way they were and the boundaries were where they are. But the reality is there's a lot of different ways to do transparency that is not the same thing as publishing a list of to the dollars and cents what the 4 of us make, right? So I think this idea that there is this acknowledgement that people have values on one hand, they want to be fair and good, and then they've gotten away with underpaying people for quite a long time. So if they got transparent and had to make big adjustments, that's where folks are feeling that like, oh, shoot, there would really be a cash impact to starting to tell the truth. But we always say, we don't want you to feel like you have secrets you have to keep. If you actually feel embarrassed about how little you're paying somebody, then you're doing something wrong. So it is time to plan for an adjustment. So I think it is coming. It is more of a cultural challenge than it is a material challenge.
Mm, mm. And just for the audience and for clarification, what are those 4 generations that you were referring to?
Yeah, so if we're talking about folks in their early 20s up into their 70s, right? So if we're thinking about boomers, Xers, millennials, and Zs, I think I got all those names right. Essentially, right, folks were brought into the workforce at really different times. And so again, that expectation is really different. And so what we talk about in the book, Hiring Revolution, is how do you actually leverage each of the generational vantage points as assets rather than irritants, because there is value in all 4 of those perspectives. And everybody in tech knows, right? Homogeneity is not the birthplace of innovation. Y'all stand on the shoulders of giants who created tech out of nothing, right? So there really is some brain trust that's around, but also the newest folks in the workplace have really different expectations. So we could either resist that and be crabby about it, or we could figure it out.
Awesome. And if you're in the audience, just go ahead and drop in the chat what generation you're a part of. We would love to see that. Shout out to all the Gen X, all the boomers, all the millennials, and all the Gen Z out there, and anyone else who's not in those. And so let's pivot a little bit to negotiation. Marissa, so pre-conversation, we talked a little bit about your background in this area. And so the question I want to ask is, are there some best practices or advice that you would give people who are trying to negotiate their salary, benefits, or compensation? And if you could just tell us what you know.
Yeah, so Ken already touched on one of the really important ones, which is to come in armed with research. What are you doing that makes the salary and other benefits, because it's not all about salary, what makes that worthwhile for your employer? So some of it has to do with what standards are in the industry and what standards are locally can be part of it. Although, like I said, I feel like not focusing so much on your area is good. But also what you bring to the table. So being able to really articulate your own value. And that I find is something that's, especially for people who are otherwise underrepresented in tech, really worthwhile to practice before you're having that conversation, because some of us have been strongly socialized never to say that out loud. Claiming your own worth can be extremely emotional for people. And so if you work through some of that prior to the conversation, you're going to be a better advocate for yourself. Actually, I have this thing that I've told a number of people. It's just to practice sometimes with another person, but it actually can be very useful to run through while you are exercising, because you are going to be nervous when you're having this conversation, and your heart rate's going to go up and your voice is going to get high, and it's hard to do. A lot of those physiological changes happen while you're exercising too. And if you literally say out loud the stuff you want to say in that negotiation, you're going to sound more confident because you've already practiced and heard it in your own voice when you're like breathing hard and your heart rate's up. So my little tip on that piece. And then the other piece is to when you're going into the negotiation, to really understand the position of the person that you're talking to. So if you're in a hiring process, you know how much work went into getting you to the point of having an offer. The hiring manager is invested in getting you across that finish line. So they're not your adversary. They're your ally. And so coming into that conversation with that in mind can decrease your anxiety, but also help you understand what your negotiating position really is. And even more so if you're negotiating internally. Presumably you're good at your job, your manager knows that, and their cost to replace you is very, very large. So they want to make it work.
Are these, just as a follow-up, are these things that people should be communicating, one-on-one, verbally, in writing? Like, what's the strategy? How does a person like start that conversation? Because it's quite difficult.
Yes. So know your situation, I would say. It kind of depends on where you are in that process. So there are some upfront questions that if you know you have deal breakers going into a job search, you may as well talk about those real early. And I would bring those up with the recruiter, whoever your first point of contact is, because if those things are not met, like you're going to waste everybody's time. And it is stressful enough to go through the job search process. Like, don't do it if it's going to be a non-starter for you at the end. But I have negotiated positions by text message. I got a tentative offer as a text, and I responded, that sounds really great. I would be an immediate yes if you could add 10%. And I simply said that by text. And I mean, I offered, if you would like to talk about it, give me a call and let's talk. We didn't need to. So that can be powerful, but I already knew I was in a strong position there. So I realize it depends can be a very frustrating answer, but think hard about the position that the person you're negotiating with is in. So in that case, I was working with a recruiter. He wasn't personally invested in the outcome, really. He wanted it to work, but he wasn't going to be offended that I was asking for more money. So I didn't have to put a lot of emotional work into thinking about how that was going to go.
So what I'm hearing is that depending on who you're talking to, they have a different relationship to you getting hired and to you being at the company and to what you're asking for. And so that could really affect the negotiation process and your approach to it.
Yes.
Ken, just quickly, kind of piggybacking off of that, are there things that candidates can do to create more leverage for themselves, to a stronger argument for why they might be asking for different benefits or compensation or salary than's being offered? What can people do to create that leverage so that they can be successful?
It's proof. I think from the hiring manager's perspective, from my perspective, it's the uncertainty comes with it's less of, as Marissa said, not an adversary, if anything, an ally, especially as I've gotten to know you over several conversations. And in my mind, I've said a yes, knowing that I have a need. My goal is not to pay you as little as possible to get the need met. My goal is really just to get my need met within budget, basically, if there's a budget that I'm I'm held to. So you have all the leverage in the world once you've convinced me that you meet the need that I have. That goes double if you were already in a high leverage position, as if you're coming from a place where you're happy. And maybe I started the conversation to begin with, like that's something that gives you leverage. But it's really about selling yourself. And I think, and that confidence, knowing what you want, knowing what your deal breakers are, and communicating that up front, that puts me on my heels. Versus, coming in with a lower salary to get the conversation started because you think that's something that, will incent me to move things along faster. No, I want good talent. I want good team members, and I want them yesterday. And so if you can make me feel like that's what you're bringing, that puts you just above and beyond where you thought you might be.
So you really have to show who you are, what you can do, and what value you're bringing, like a value proposition. Trina, I see all sorts of wheels, tinkering around, and I know you have some great stuff to tell us. Did any of this resonate with you? And what are your thoughts on what you've just heard?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that it's just super vulnerable to talk at the intersection of what you need and what you want. And I think a thing to really dig into is that confidence looks different on different people, right? So we know here in Minnesota, we are home to an enormous resettled refugee population. We know we have folks for whom English is a second language who are excellent at their job. We know we have folks who are first, second, and third gen. And so this idea that some of the cultures that are part of our Minnesota community, humility is the highest value. So the idea of selling oneself is actually offensive or outside of somebody's values, right? And so I think that idea that to get really creative, to everybody's point about how you sort of show your work and show your value add. So, and we also talk about, it's really important to define the difference between cost of living adjustments and merit-based raises. So we talk a lot about how is what you're asking for or about to do more responsibility, right? Different, going to have a bigger impact, drive closer to mission, or something of that nature, right? So it's not just, I've been here a long time, so I deserve more money. It's what am I willing to do, participate in, take on, try, drive, right? So to be able to describe that, and then again, know that everybody's affect and communication style is really strongly influenced by who they were raised by, the cultural community that they're a part of. So also as folks who are listening to people asking for money, recognizing that we should not be reading into tone and telling ourselves that tone is related to ability. So somebody might be quiet when asking for more. Somebody might be loud when asking for more. Somebody might do it in writing. Somebody might do it in person, right? And again, because women and trans folks and people of color have not been paid equal for equal work for decades, even though it's against the law, recognize that there is different stressors on folks' financial situations and futures. So there are higher stakes for some people who simply want more money and some people who might not be able to send their kid to college if they don't get more money. So the stakes are really different, and it's just good to remember that.
It kind of speaks to the reason why people have jobs in the first place, so that we can live our lives and take care of the people that we love and ourselves, of course. So if you're in the audience, today is a really special event because this is one of the few times, at least in my own life, where I've seen 4 people from underrepresented intersectional backgrounds have a conversation like this in the public eye. And so we can't, go without talking about equity. And I know, Trina, you wrote a great book about this, and I would consider you probably an expert just based on how you're speaking about it today. When people hear equity in tech, a lot of times it's like, oh, y'all are getting paid a lot of money anyways. These are big careers. These, it can sound like first world problems. What are the real issues when it comes to equity, and how does this stuff play out in tech, and why should we care? Any of those questions, so you have the floor.
So we think about both the business and moral imperative, right? And so the idea that companies that have women and people of color in leadership, not just in lowest paid internship roles, are more profitable than other companies, right? And this is not about having a United Colors of Benetton photo we're all feeling really proud about. It's the fact that we're better problem solvers on mixed teams. And a lot of what tech is being asked to do is invent, create, solve problems, come up with new solutions, right? So it is a really high intensive industry for collaboration, which up until now hasn't been a skill set that people think about as super relevant, right? So just this idea of sort of the hero or the lone wolf or the person who's just going to be excellent by themselves in a vacuum. That's not how tech works, right? That's not how project works. Very few folks can bring a project through to completion on their own. And again, folks are sort of shying away from just the reality of the conversation that for way too long, folks who have been driving tech are really homogenous, right? That women have been kept out of tech and that people of color have been kept out of tech. So first, we're going to tell the truth about it. And then we can start to sort of make this shift. And again, I want folks to understand how big the gaps are, because way too often we talk about equity as something from the before times, right? A lot of us may have seen Dr. King quotes yesterday in celebration of his birthday. We talk about it like this movement is over. The reality is, and we learned this when we were doing the book, if you look at the intersections of race and gender, women of color are the lowest paid people in America, right? And so right now, when we were doing the book, we learned that it is not going to be until the year 2224 that Latinx women are going to be paid on par with white men. So we're going to be really dead by then, right? That is 8 generations from now. So the idea that we can absolutely right now have clearer conversations about closing these gaps in our lifetime. If we're some of the folks who actually are responsible in our industries, we have to just decide the gaps are too offensive to let them continue, and that we can't keep habitually underpaying people just because that's been the norm. And so again, zooming in on priority populations, not because race or gender is like in the news or it's hot, it's because data is really clear. It is the biggest difference making the difference in salary.
Wow. One thing that stuck out to me that you mentioned was that companies that have women or possibly other identities represented in their boards are more profitable, probably because they can solve different types of problems for different types of customers. It almost sounds to me like there should even be like some sort of premium, right? Because there is also a lack of people from these identities in the field as well. So just one more follow up, and then I'll open the floor to the other speakers. But what does that look like? Should companies try to treat this as some sort of premium? Is it attractive to think of it that way?
Yeah, so it's both a short and a long-term project, right? So long-term, folks are trying to figure out the pipeline, right? Who's even getting talked to about the kinds of jobs folks could then go get trained to have externships, internships, right? Connections with companies. So like that's one of the long-term things to sort of figure out. And then you absolutely legally can say that you are really interested in talking to a diverse pool of candidates. What is illegal is hiring or not hiring somebody solely based on an identity. We 100% agree with that. But it's okay to say, hey, we have a noticing right now that 85% of our middle managers are men. So in this hiring pool, we're going to keep it open until at least 50% of the candidates are women, right? So you can actually set some measurable goals to attract who you're seeking.
Mm. So creating metrics and then hopefully being transparent and creating visibility.
Yep.
Ken, what do you think about this? Is pay and equity, are these conversations that you're hearing happening? What's your experience?
Yeah, I think just from my personal perspective, I think one of the things I can absolutely speak to personally is that when you have people from diverse backgrounds in leadership positions, they're automatically incented to counter the general trends that we've seen in the industry. And so I'm aware of the biases that have been against me and those like me. And so I can actively counter those in conversations as I look to hire. And I think that's me and my example. I alone am not diverse, and so that's why you need diverse leadership across different boundaries to account for that across all the different groups.
Mm.
But I can
Marissa,
speak to that being very true. Like that's what I do in my role. So.
Yeah, and another place where having diversity in the hiring company is really helpful is in your hiring process. Like as a candidate, it is very, very obvious to me when I'm only interviewing with white men. And that has been the case at almost everywhere I have ever applied. My background, I didn't, I think, say this in my intro, but I wasn't a developer. I was a system administrator before I moved into management. And I was typically the only woman on my team. I was never reported to another woman. In fact, I never reported to anyone who wasn't a white man. And I interviewed with very few people who were not when I was getting DevOps and sysadmin roles. And that is discouraging as a candidate. And now one of the things that I think having more places to choose from as a candidate, you can be a lot pickier about a place where you feel like you will be a good culture fit because you're not going to be the only one. And that makes a huge difference. And it also affects pay. I think my experience personally anyway has been that affects pay as well, not in a positive way.
Earlier, we were talking about how pay is not the only thing that people want. People also want to have a good environment. They want to have good benefits and stuff. And we're also talking about remote work. One of the identities that I don't think we've mentioned yet are people who live with various disabilities. I'm not sure what the correct political language for that is, but Trina, could you just talk a little bit about what does equity and benefits, what do they look like in the context of this new pandemic world, and how are companies accommodating for people who might have physical or health needs outside of what's legally required?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we encourage people to first take a look at sort of the top 10 identities that have that are sort of considered federally protected classes, and to remember that when you're employing people, it is highly likely that they will be people while they work for you. They are in bodies with families and needs. There are surprising things that come up and unsurprising things. So we're either going to relate to our people as assets or irritants, right? And we got to figure out sort of that paradigm shift. So we have a section in Hiring Revolution called How White Are Your Benefits? Because one of the things that we're not sort of paying attention to is we're not thinking about immigration, ability, class background, ethnicity, religious tradition, gender identity, sexual orientation, and more. And so we sort of review one by one those lists, again, not because it's like the cool list, but the reality is most of us in our lifetime will end up with a hidden or visible disability, right? So that could be cognitive, that could be emotional, that could be physical. And so what we talk about is leadership readiness. Why are we so unprepared to have people have a sick kid at work? Why are we so unprepared that people have a really different visual abilities when it comes to, like, when I turned 40, I'm always like, make the font bigger. Like, that's all I'm ever saying to our staff, right? Yeah. So just this idea that we seem to keep being surprised by really predictable bodies, right? People needing different things. And so what we do is we just walk through benefits from healthcare to stipends to things you can provide on an equity basis, because again, the goal isn't same, because we actually don't need the exact same to thrive, right? Just because I need a bigger monitor doesn't mean somebody else does. Just because somebody else's Sabbath on a Saturday doesn't mean mine is, right? So again, just this idea of, if you are going to hire a mixed group of human beings, there are ways to get readier for supporting them to do excellent work.
And I'll ask this question to Marissa, kind of relating to that. It sounds like a lot of what I'm hearing too is that time, is useful as a benefit in multiple ways, to take care of your family, for mental health, or even the pace of work. How do people negotiate time? Is that even something that people can negotiate in a conversation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. People can negotiate time. I think having an expectation that your employer or your future employer is going to have flexibility is actually one of the key things, because it's difficult to anticipate what you even are going to need moving. Like, for instance, the pandemic is a great example of this. How many people thought they needed to have flexibility to essentially homeschool their own children for more than a year? I think most people, when they negotiated whatever job they had at the start of the pandemic, were not expecting that. But if they went somewhere with a workplace culture that had the flexibility to accommodate their changing needs, they were able to stick with that. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing the great resignation is that a lot of companies did not have that flexibility. And belatedly, employers are realizing that they need to have that. And it's also not one size fits all for each type of need. So not everyone who has a visual impairment needs the bigger monitor. There are other accommodations that might be useful. And so knowing what you need at that moment and being able to articulate it and advocate for yourself is very helpful. But also evaluating a future employer for that kind of flexibility. So you feel like you may start your job and not have a problem with depression or burnout, but after 2 years of the pandemic, maybe you do. If you have a good relationship with your manager and with your company, you're able to express, like, I need some support here. And you may or may not even know what you need. And the first step is working with your manager to figure out what is going to support you in your current needs.
Mm. What I'm hearing a lot from many of the things you're saying is that a lot of these conversations do require a lot of vulnerability, a lot of willingness to share, and also receptiveness as well. We only have a few more minutes left, so I wanted to ask just some quick rapid fire questions, and then we'll close out the session and come full circle at the end with some plugs. So the first rapid fire question is, what are companies doing right? And I'm going to start off with Trina. What are 3 things that companies are doing right in this moment?
Ooh, 3. Okay. So companies are learning more what their team actually needs. Companies are listening better when folks are really showing that they can do high quality, excellent work from home, right? And companies are starting to understand the reality that change is the constant. So now that we know there isn't a going back, right? Whatever the new thing is, it's the new normal, it's a future of hybrid, it's something. So I do think there was still a kind of holding resistance that now folks are holding a little less tightly to, and just saying, hey, I'm unpracticed. I'm an expert at other things than this, but I am willing to learn what we're going to need to do to be successful. So I think that growth mindset is really beautiful.
And for you, Ken, what is something that you wish that job seekers knew about hiring managers or the hiring process?
We said it earlier, but not your adversary. It's not. We're not coming to do battle. It's not. We're not playing poker. I'm trying to get a need. A role filled. Chances are we've spoken, and I want to work with you, and I want to pay you fairly. And I want to pay you what you feel you deserve. And ideally, all those things line up. Sometimes they don't. And ideally, that's where the mismatch is. It's not a function of you gave a number that's too low, and so I got you. That's not my intention. I would argue that that's not the intention of any good manager out there. So kind of to add to your previous question, I think something that I'm seeing that's good about that's happening within companies is they're being more intentional about good managers and not just promoting people. That's not the only mechanism, particularly in tech, to get promoted.
When you said that, it reminded me of this scene from this show Parks and Recreation, where the manager's sitting in the really tall chair, and then the employee sitting in the really small chair, and that's kind of like the typical image people have with negotiations. And then the last question for you, Marissa: what can someone do today to start off this kind of conversation with their employer or with a future employer? What can they do practically or pragmatically to make a difference starting today?
I think the biggest thing would probably be make a list of what you're accomplishing and what you're doing. If you're going to have that conversation with your employer, if it doesn't go well, you might have it with a future employer. Just in the privacy of your own head or your own notebook or your own Word document, sing your own praises and understand what your value prop really looks like. And you can do that even if you're not planning on having that conversation, even if the idea of having that conversation scares you into absolute silence today. If you are prepared for it, 2 months from now maybe is when you actually have the conversation.
I love that. Practicing in the mirror and figuring out what you want to say ahead of time. So that brings us to the end of our session today. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can follow Ministar on any of the social media accounts that we have. The links are in the chat right now, and go ahead and send us a tweet. Let us know what you enjoyed about today's session. If you have any other questions, you can also tweet us those questions as well, and we'll love to get back to you, or possibly even plan more sessions like this in the future. We do have an upcoming session on February the 16th. It'll be the 5th part of this series, focusing on people who are transitioning from being a consultant to a full-time employee, and talking about the differences between those two styles of employment. And then if you're around in March, we'll also be talking about personal finance. So as I mentioned, follow us on social media and send us those tweets, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and have a great rest of your week. Adios.